In 2019, the intelligence community convinced a good portion of Congress and the American people that Donald Trump had committed impeachable offenses. Now, this is the second time that Donald Trump was facing impeachment charges. The first time surrendered around the Steele dossier and the idea of colluding with the Russians in order to steal the 2020 election. And the more we found out about that, the more we realized that Hillary Clinton's campaign had actually funded a lot of the intel that went into it. But the second time seemed to carry more weight. There was an anonymous whistleblower that had suggested that Donald Trump was pressuring President Zelensky of Ukraine to open up an investigation that could have directly impacted Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, and the overall presidential campaign. Using this information, they launched something of an investigation, and they convinced Congress to launch further impeachment hearings, right? The intelligence community used the credibility of that organization in order to push this particular narrative. And if they had sufficient evidence, that would make sense. But what Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, has just revealed is they didn't have sufficient evidence. So what exactly were they going off of? Was it justified in any shape or form? And what does this actually say about the various institutions that we're supposed to trust? Because I don't think anybody doubts right now that we're at an all-time low with trusting institutions that at one point the American people felt like they could put their faith in. And the thing is that this isn't by accident. In fact, there may be two reasons why this is happening so frequently, and we're going to get to that in this episode. With me in studio is my co-host Christian Hines, the Oracle of Virginia. All right, Christian, we're going to jump in here first to this statement from Tulsi Gabbard, and this has to do with the press release that kind of brought all this up to the forefront again. DNI Tulsi Gabbard exposes conspiracy used by Congress to impeach President Trump. Goes on to say, IC Inspector General Atkinson aggressively advanced a so-called whistleblower's narrative using a witness who co-authored the 2017 Russia hoax that was used as the basis for Trump's impeachment. So keep in mind, right off the bat, if you're the IG, if you're the Inspector General that is supposed to look at these whistleblower claims and whatnot, and the whistleblower that you're utilizing to determine whether or not Trump has committed impeachable offenses was already involved in co-authoring a different set of intel that led to the first impeachment, which obviously was not successful and was starting to undergo a great deal of scrutiny, you would think an Inspector General at that point would say, okay, I'm going to run this claim through the typical process in order to vet it, in order to make sure that it's a valid claim. But that doesn't appear to be what happened. In fact, it goes on. During his preliminary investigation into President Trump's July 2019 phone conversation with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, former IG Michael Atkinson did not follow standard IG procedures and relied upon politicized, manufactured narratives, only conducting interviews with 4 individuals: the whistleblower, the whistleblower's friend, who was a co-author of the January 2017 Russian hoax intelligence community assessment, and a close colleague of disgraced former FBI agent Peter, how do you pronounce his last name? Strzok? I don't know. And 2 character references who had zero firsthand knowledge of the July 2019 phone call. Despite a lack of any firsthand evidence, keep that in mind here, no firsthand evidence, Atkinson proceeded to take actions to weaponize the whistleblower process and exceed his statutory jurisdiction by ignoring Department of Justice guidance and relying only on secondhand testimony to ensure the whistleblower complaint was released to Congress, referred to the FBI, and leaked to the propaganda media. Then House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence Chairman Adam Schiff and then Speaker Nancy Pelosi used this false secondhand narrative to create media intrigue and ultimately spark the basis to impeach President Trump in December of 2019, which, again, keep in mind, this is when we've got presidential elections going on. So their whole claim is that President Trump had this conversation with Zelensky in order to damage Joe Biden and Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden. But if you look at the way that they actually utilize that information, they completely ignored the standard process for this, brought it to the forefront, made sure it was leaked to the press. Why? So they could launch impeachment hearings in the midst of a presidential election cycle. So once again, we have this case where it appears the Democrats were once again doing the very thing they were accusing President Trump and Republicans of doing. Now, Christian, I know you brought up some other articles on this as well to kind of zero in a little bit more on what's going on. What I want people to understand about this, and again, obviously I'm a conservative. Obviously I've supported Donald Trump. But the other thing that I used to be was an 18 Fox, which was a Special Forces intelligence sergeant. And here's what that meant. It meant that when I deployed overseas with my ODA, I was the guy that was responsible for working with our people that were managing source networks, working with the intelligence community, working with the intel assets that we had within the Army and the Department of Defense in order to put together targeting packets. And there were various processes that we used for that. Now, there's always some discretion when you're putting together intelligence packets. There's always some bias that you have to account for, which is usually why you have other people that you're talking to and are scrutinizing your information before you actually go and execute a target. Because when you're operating overseas, obviously it can be very dangerous if you have bad intel. But when you're talking about criminal activity in the United States, there's a different threshold for this. Right, because we're supposed to follow the Constitution. We're supposed to look at criminal proceedings through the lens of our justice system, not just whatever an intel report can put together. So, yeah, in one world, intel reports can be full of either good information, bad information. And typically what we do when we look at sources is we rank our sources. We rank our sources by whether or not we believe that we can trust them through previous activity and interactions. We also look at whether or not they have proper access and placement to give the information that they're telling us. If someone walks in off the street and says, I've got information on a bombing that's going to happen, one of the things that we do to analyze this and decipher whether or not it's good intelligence or bad is we look at this individual. We say, how credible are they? What do we know about them? Have they given us information before? Has it turned out being correct? You want to know one of the other things that we do? And again, we're not even talking about criminal justice. We're talking about standard operating procedures for the intelligence community in wartime. We try to vet that information with another independent source. So for instance, if I have two people come in together and share information, I'm going to look at both sources, but I'm also going to recognize, hey, these guys know each other. They might have colluded. They might have collaborated with one another. Is there any other independent source that can verify what they're saying that I can be reasonably certain was not in a position to collaborate with the original leaker or the original person that provided the information? If I can't, that goes on a different level with respect to my reliability of my source, with respect to the validity of the claims. That's what we do for overseas combat operations. Where the criminal justice system doesn't apply, where the levels of scrutiny don't apply. But here, when we're talking about impeaching a president during an election cycle, this is what they're able to use. The reason why I'm telling you all this is because I want you to understand that regardless of what my bias might be, this was inappropriate. This is not the standard process. And apparently this was pushed before Congress way before there was enough information to validate it. That's where she's saying that when this went over to the Department of Justice, again, we're going from intel community to Department of Justice because they're the ones that handle criminal proceedings. And Department of Justice looks at this and goes, yeah, you don't have sufficient evidence to actually run this down. And they just ignored it. Why? Well, because Adam Schiff wanted to run it down. Golly gee willikers. I wonder why that was. What was the article that you were bringing up, Christian?
I mean, we've got a few headlines here, right?
Well, this is important, right? Because they didn't just say, hey, here's the intel that we found. Tulsi Gabbard actually has sent criminal referrals to the DOJ for ex-IG whistleblower tied to Trump impeachment. So understand, this is important. This is what a lot of people I think would say I voted for, right? Stop just exposing when something bad has happened and start showing me what sort of consequences are going to be realized as a result of this. And so the fact that this has gone from the intel community over to the DOJ with criminal referrals, this is the director of national intelligence saying, hey, I think something illegal happened here. And that's significant. All right, ladies and gentlemen, when we answer the question of who can we trust, who can we trust? Well, we should have people that are transparent about the processes that they use in order to vet information. And here's one that I trust, and that is Brave Books. Because Brave Books are pro-God, pro-America stories that teach courage, faith, love of country through books that kids actually want to read. Because let's face it, if you're going to say I'm patriotic, if you're going to say I'm Christian, if you're going to say I'm all of these things, well, then you should be the best at what you do. And Brave Books does an excellent job of being able to provide parents and children with literature, with educational and entertaining literature that parents can actually trust, right? They're not going to get to page 7 in the story and find out that the unicorn is trans, right? That's not going to happen in Brave Books. So right now, well, here's what I want you to do. Go to bravebooks.com/Nick, right? And then you're going to use code Nick. So the bravebooks.com/Nick lets them know that we sent you. Use code Nick. You're going to get 20% off your first order and free access, check this out, to Brave's parent-vetted streaming platform when you join the Brave Book Club. Again, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a standard that an organization uses to say, here's how we vet things. Here's our process. You can not only check it, you can be a part of it. You can be a part of it. And that gives me a lot of sense that these guys are doing the right thing. So go to bravebooks.com/Nick and don't forget to use code Nick for 20% off your order. Go check them out today.
The problem with all of this isn't that, they didn't have like the full picture. The problem is that they knew that they didn't have all the evidence, and they retroactively changed the rules basically without telling anybody in order to justify going through this impeachment process, right? Like the whistleblower did not, first off, he was a Biden hack. That should have stopped the whole story right there. But second off, he didn't have firsthand knowledge or evidence of this phone call, right? Mm-hmm. He said that he got it from a secondhand source. And then they retroactively changed the complaint form. Mm-hmm. Adam Schiff got that information and then withheld it from another House committee. Again, knowing that if they had that information, there would have been an objection to the way that the whistleblower complaint was handled because they didn't follow the original process.
Yeah. Well, in fact,
they changed the you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of in New York, they retroactively changed the law in order to allow for a lawsuit against Donald Trump.
When we heard about the 34 felonies, what most people don't understand is they're thinking like 34 separate felonies in the sense like 34 separate crimes took place. And in reality, it was 34 separate emails that were all referencing the same thing. And by the way, once upon a time, those would have all been misdemeanors at best. It was a Democrat legislator that tried to retroactively made them felonies. And then, by the way, that same legislator was actually later, I think, indicted using the law that he used against President Trump. And you know what his own lawyers used in his defense? Well, that law is not constitutional. No kidding. But again, that didn't matter. It served its purpose. Its purpose was not to bring justice. Its purpose was not to coincide with the Constitution or traditions. The purpose was to achieve a political objective, and it did. Go back to the press release again from DNI, from Tulsi Gabbard, because if you scroll down, there's something else in here that's important. Scroll down to where it says whistleblowers, partisan bias, and lies confirmed. This is the part where you get into the realm of potential criminal activity. So if you zoom in on that, what it says is the whistleblower admitted she lied to the Inspector General about speaking to Democrats in Congress ahead of submitting allegations of wrongdoing by President Trump to the IC Inspector General. So keep this in mind. Before this person whistleblows, they go over to the Democrats and they say, hey, what do you think about this? Right? So that right off the bat, it's not that they went to Congress, they went to Democrats and they asked this question. And then it says, while media widely reported on this detail in 2019, the pre-complaint meeting with Congress has never been confirmed by the whistleblower. In October 2019, after the media began to report that the whistleblower had spoken with Congress ahead of submitting the disclosure of urgent concern form, the whistleblower called the ICIG to admit that he or she had in fact spoken with Congress. Atkinson admits in newly declassified testimony that his investigative team did ask the complainant who else knew about the disclosure, and the complainant withheld from the investigative team within the 14-day window that he or she had alerted Adam Schiff and Democratic staff, or Adam Schiff's Democratic staff. Here we go. Whistleblower interviews reveal the political biases of the whistleblower in his or her own words. The whistleblower states that he or she is a registered Democrat. The whistleblower claims to have worked closely with Vice President Biden, traveled with Biden to Ukraine, and was part of conversations where Lusenko corruption was discussed. The whistleblower also claims to have become the target of right-wing bloggers and conspiracy theorists. Yet, Atkinson ignored this and insisted during his testimony to the HPSCI, that's the House Intelligence Committee, I also want to make it clear that I never considered the whistleblower to be politically biased. Really? I mean, none of that suggests to you potential political bias. Despite public records that the whistleblower worked with Vice President Biden on Ukraine matters, inquiries into the whistleblower's bias and motive were blocked during the 2020 impeachment. Again, this is one of those things that when you're vetting a source, you always look at things like this. What is their potential motivations that could lead them to make conclusions that are not getting at the truth, but instead trying to manipulate you to achieve objectives that they want? All of this is sufficient to question the motivations of the whistleblower, and Atkinson did essentially none of it. It goes on to say, Inspector General weaponized the whistleblower process. Newly declassified documents confirm that Atkinson failed to conduct basic due diligence and willfully exceeded his statutory jurisdiction to mischaracterize the president's phone call with Zelensky as an urgent concern to Congress. From day one, Atkinson knew that a transcript of President Trump's call existed, and yet he never, throughout the entire preliminary investigation, requested to access it. So let me get this straight. Put this in perspective. You're the IG. Somebody comes to you and is like, hey, I have this real concern that President Trump is currently threatening the president of Ukraine in order to try to dig up dirt that he can use against Joe Biden. Now, keep in mind, corruption and U.S. involvement in Ukraine had been a big problem, right? The whole thing with Hunter Biden being involved with these various oligarchs in Ukraine had been a big problem. This had been something that was curious, we'll say. So, and then somebody comes and says, no, that's not what was going on. President Trump wasn't asking the sort of standard questions you would ask the president of the United States to ask of another country who is getting, all kinds of aid from the United States. No, it's not that. He's trying to impact the 2020 election. You would think that the first thing that you would want to do in order to validate this claim is actually look at the transcript of the call. You would want to look at the testimony that was being provided. You would want to look at the transcript of the call, and you would want to look at it and say, okay, is the person that's giving me this information providing me a reasonable, contextual, and comprehensive understanding of what actually took place on the call? But this guy didn't even do this. That's again, that's so blatantly wrong as to be intentional. This is not something that I could chalk up to this guy's just a moron, right? I have to chalk this up to he's intentionally not doing things that a reasonable person would do in order to achieve it. After the DOJ reviewed the whistleblower complaint and determined there was no urgent concern, Atkinson ignored their determination and proceeded to transmit this faulty whistleblower complaint to Congress without completing a fulsome investigation, despite allegations being made based on secondhand information. Once again, you have to ask, why does this process in place in the first place? Well, because if somebody does actually uncover something that's actual corruption or treason or fraud or something of that nature, you got to have a formal process where that person can be protected as they make their claims. However, we also understand that people can make claims, especially within a political environment, that has very little to do with the truth and a lot more to do with their desired political outcomes. The fact that this is going on during a presidential election, right, is significant. That's something that should be considered, not because you would excuse fraud, waste, abuse, corruption, treason, but because you want to make sure that the sources that you have are properly vetted. He deliberately didn't do that. The whole idea of him walking this over to Congress is essentially him saying, I want this to get out into the public. Because do you guys think for 1 second, by handing this over to Congress in a very public fashion, he was thinking to himself, oh, Congress is simply going to go down and they're going to do a very, very thorough investigation to make sure that all of these claims are properly vetted? Do you think that's what he thought? I certainly don't. As was reported at the time, the ICOIG altered the whistleblower form within months of the July 2019 phone call to no longer require firsthand knowledge as a prerequisite for reporting complaints. That's what Christian was just talking about. So now we have a couple of different things that he's done. First of all, he hasn't followed the normal procedure. Second of all, he hasn't properly vetted the sources that he has actually given him this information. He hasn't gone and checked what the sources are telling him with the actual transcript of the call in order to determine whether or not the source is giving good information or whether or not there's a different reasonable interpretation of what actually took place. He submits it to the FBI. The FBI looks at it and says, you don't have enough to go on, especially with respect to an urgent concern. Right? And then what does he do? He walks it over to Congress. And then at the same time that he's walking over to Congress, he's changing the whistleblower form to no longer require firsthand knowledge as a prerequisite for reporting complaints. So understand what he's doing here. Now, for everybody that's looking at this going, well, I don't care. I hate Trump so much that this is fine. Great. Great. If that's your position, understand the precedent that you've now set is anybody can make a second-hand claim, and now it's going to go directly to Congress. Does that sound like a good idea? But that's the precedent being set. And this is why this is not just exposing this as incompetence. This is not just exposing this as, political machinations. No, this is saying you broke the law. There needs to be a formal investigation to determine whether or not you face criminal penalties for this. Now, again, the DNI cannot do that, right? President Trump cannot just make it so. This now has to go through the Department of Justice. Now, I will say this. I think one of the reasons why Pam Bondi was removed from the Department of Justice was because I think Trump was frustrated at the lack of progress on actually going after building a case and trying some of the people that had been perpetuating things like this. I think he wanted a more aggressive DOJ. And there's people now that are saying, well, see, he's weaponizing the DOJ. If you want to know what true weaponization is not the president telling the Department of Justice, I want you to go out and prosecute people who broke the law. If the president was coming in and saying, hey, look, I don't care what evidence you have, I want him going to trial, that would be one thing. But no, the case that we have here is we do have evidence of wrongdoing. We do have a trail where pretty much any thinking human being can look at this and go, this looks like a deliberate manipulation of the process in order to directly influence a presidential election cycle. And there's nothing wrong with the president or the people that voted for this wanting there to be accountability. This is inappropriate. If you allow people to get away with this, it will continue to be done. And eventually, Democrats who might be watching, Republicans will get the idea that, you know what? This is just the way the game is played. Now, did you have anything more that you want to talk about this specifically? We're going to the implications of the institutional mistrust.
There's a couple things that I want to say. So, for starters, the whistleblower complaint form that was basically altered, right? That was, I dare I say that it was doctored. There was a simple question that was in that form about, have you spoken to a member of Congress about this? Mm-hmm. Well, that form, he basically said no, which is a total lie because we know for a fact that he met with Adam Schiff's staff. And the closed door testimony that was taking place in the House Intel Committee, which was Schiff's committee, the Inspector General Atkinson, he, basically the testimony that was given to that committee was withheld from the House Judiciary Committee. Even though Adam Schiff had all of that information, he knew that the whistleblower complaint form had been altered. Mm-hmm. He knew that the whistleblower only claimed secondhand or hearsay evidence, which was contrary to the traditional practice of, you need firsthand evidence. And he knew that it was a lie that the whistleblower had in fact spoken with a member of Congress, and he knew it because he was the member of Congress that the whistleblower had spoken to. Mm-hmm. And so he knew all of this information, and he withheld it from another House committee that was in charge of overseeing the entire impeachment process.
Yeah.
So they lied on the legalistic process. They then covered up the fact that they lied. They then said, we have all this evidence from this, closed door committee hearing in the Intel Committee, and you have to run with this, House Judiciary Committee. You have to use this in order to justify impeaching Trump. But, we're not actually going to show you any of the stuff that we doctored, that we manipulated, that we changed the rules on, that we lied about.
Yeah.
And so the entire impeachment process from the beginning basically was fabricated.
Yeah. Well, and check out the statement from Democrat Senator Mark Warner, who, again, Mark Warner is considered one of the more moderate, one of the more reasonable Democrat senators. He said, Director Gabbard's decision to refer a lawful intelligence community whistleblower for criminal prosecution appears to be a retaliatory act for whistleblowing itself, the very kind of politically motivated reprisal our laws are written to prevent, and one she previously pledged under oath before Congress to guard against. That is an exact inversion of the truth.
Yeah, so the impeachment was the actual retaliatory political process in order to derail Trump's presidency, tie him up for months, destroy him in the public limelight by saying, oh, look, he's scandal-ridden. We haven't had an impeachment since Bill Clinton. Yeah. And then set this all up in order to try to defeat him in 2020. Like you said, it's a total inversion from what actually happened. The impeachment itself was the politically motivated act here.
Well, and this is the part too. You look at his statement specifically. Decision to refer a lawful intelligence community whistleblower for criminal prosecution. Well, no, that's the part that's being questioned, Senator Mark Warner, is whether or not it was a lawful intelligence community whistleblower. What does that even mean? A lawful intelligence community whistleblower? No, right now it looks like it wasn't lawful. Right now it looks like the procedure was manipulated. And then he goes on to say, a retaliatory act for whistleblowing itself. No, it could be theoretically a retaliatory attack for completely manipulating the whistleblower protections to achieve political objectives. The very kind of politically motivated reprisal all laws are written to prevent. See, this is one of those things. They always look at the laws are written to help Democrats achieve their objectives. And when it doesn't achieve their objectives, well, then now there's some violation. There's something wrong with the system. There's something wrong with the process. But here's the issue. If you use the whistleblower process inappropriately, you diminish the value of the whistleblower process. That needs to be punished. Because if you don't punish it, what you've now encouraged is for other people to abuse the whistleblower process. I've talked about this before when it comes to things like the laws of land warfare. And I've said, well, look, if you treat a terrorist the same way that you treat a uniformed soldier, you've just said that there's no benefit for following the rules. And so to uphold the rules of land warfare, you have to punish terrorists different. Well, and to uphold the rules associated with whistleblowing, you have to punish the people that abuse the process for whistleblowing. If you just say, so let me understand this correctly, Senator Mark Warner. What you're saying is that if a quote unquote whistleblower abuses the process, we can't go after them because they're a whistleblower? Well, okay, great. Then I always identify as a whistleblower. No matter what I say, no matter what I claim, no matter what evidence, no matter what I do, no matter how inappropriately I manipulate the system for my own processes, provided as I identify as a whistleblower, you can't do anything about it legally. Does that make sense, Senator Warner? Because that's what you're essentially suggesting here. But again, Senator Warner is smart enough to know that, no, this doesn't make sense, but it doesn't matter. You just push the claim. You just push the claim and act as if this is an entire retaliatory strike against the whole idea of people bravely speaking out about corruption. But that doesn't appear to be what this individual did. And now you're running cover for him, which again, surprises absolutely no one. But it goes to this larger issue that I want to talk about next. And this is this whole process of using processes, systems, and institutions for their credibility to achieve your own end states. Now, we've talked about this before where it's the idea, I think it was, Iowa Hawk.
There's an old tweet from about 10 years ago.
See if you can look that up, because if we can actually find it, that I'd rather just quote him specifically. But what he was essentially referring to is this idea of people using the credibility of an institution in order to achieve their objectives, in basically contrary to what made that institution legitimate in the first place. And he referred to it as is infiltrating an organization and then wearing it around as a skin suit and demanding that you give it the same credibility it had before you gutted it.
Here we go. I've got the... He tweeted this 10 years ago, November 2015.
Yeah, David Berg. Identify, well, you read it.
Identify a respected institution, kill it, gut it, wear its carcass as a skin suit while demanding respect. Hashtag lefties. It's so old. There's a hashtag attached to it.
Yeah.
Man, he nailed it. He nailed this one, didn't he?
No, it's absolutely true.
It's funny how this has been the case for years now.
Yeah. Well, and again, anybody can be guilty of doing something like this, regardless of the political spectrum. But here's the part that you've got to remember. Yuri Bezmenov used to talk about this. Yuri Bezmenov did a great interview in the 80s where he was talking about active measures. And it was certain things that the Soviet Union had done to try to demoralize the United States. And what's interesting is when you connect that up with what Antonio Gramsci was writing about in the 30s on how to create cultural Marxism, it became the long march through the institutions. What does that mean? Well, it is when a leftist essentially infiltrates a respected institution and then seeks to do a couple of things. The first thing they seek to do is co-opt the institution. So the institution has social credibility, which is to say that the American people generally trust why the institution exists and that it's actually fulfilling its stated duties in a way that is respectable. Not perfect, but respectable. You infiltrate that organization and now you start using it to do other things that help you achieve your political objectives and your ideological outcomes. Eventually, what ends up happening is people discover what you're doing, right? So they discover what you're doing and the institution itself loses credibility. Now, you might think to yourself, oh, well, that's not what you wanted to achieve, right? You wanted to be parasitic, but you didn't want to kill your host. That's true to a point, unless it's an organization they want to kill anyways. So you see what they're doing is they infiltrate it and they use it for a particular purpose until that purpose is discovered. And then when the institution no longer has credibility, they leave it and they go on to a different institution because they achieve both of their objectives. They got to use it for their own purposes all the way up to the point that they couldn't, and then they killed the institution they didn't like in the first place. And that's what's being accomplished here. Speaking of institutions you can trust, you can actually trust, Good Ranchers. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Good Ranchers provides the best American-raised, 100% American supply chain. Beef, pork, poultry, wild-caught seafood. I'm telling you, it's excellent. This is not just an organization I believe in because they share our values. It's an organization I believe in because I use them on almost a daily basis. I am constantly eating their steaks, their chicken. It's all wonderful. It's all wonderful. And you know what? It's nice when it's just delivered to your door. When you're sitting there and you're like, gosh, what are we going to have for dinner? And then all of a sudden the doorbell goes off and there is that big, beautiful Good Ranchers box with the solutions to all of your dinner questions, right? That's what I love so much about these guys. And again, they represent our values, not just in the things that they say, but in the way that they run their company and the way that they take care of their employees and the way they take care of American ranchers. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to goodranchers.com/Nick to get $25 off your first order and free meat for life when you subscribe. That's right. Not only are they providing you a great product, but they're throwing in additional free meat with your subscription. Plus, Good Ranchers, you want to talk about actually listening to the customers. Customers came and said, Good Ranchers, I love your product, but there's one change I'd love to see. I'd love to be able to build my own box. I'd love to be able to pick and choose what goes into the box that I'm going to be sent. Good Ranchers listen, and now they are providing that. So if you've always wanted to try Good Ranchers, but maybe they were offering boxes where you liked 80% of it, but maybe 20% you wanted something different, no worries. Now you can build your own from scratch. So go check that out. Go to goodranchers.com/Nick for $25 off and free meat in every box for your subscription. Go check them out. Think about it. The left is, I mean, there are reasons to have skepticism of the intelligence community, right? Just like there's reasons to have a healthy degree of, let's say, skepticism toward any government body where you question, okay, what is it doing? What's its purpose? Is it a legitimate function of government? Now, I think anybody could make a decent argument for why the federal government, which is largely responsible for dealing with foreign affairs, invasion, protecting the homeland, et cetera, would want to have organizations that are focused on providing intelligence for analyzing what adversaries of the United States are doing and, in making cases and providing information to the elected officials with respect to how we should handle those adversaries. That makes sense. I don't think anybody is against that function in principle. But we also recognize that when an intelligence agency acts with impunity or it acts contrary to what its stated objectives are, namely upholding the United States Constitution and our way of life, it starts to lose credibility. And we saw that not just with this. We saw that with that. You have that the headline from all of the former intelligence professionals that came out and said that the Hunter Biden laptop was a Russian hoax. Well, we now know it wasn't a Russian hoax. It was absolutely valid. It documented, Hunter Biden documented himself engaging in several felonies. And yet we had all these people from the intelligence community saying that was a hoax. They knew it wasn't. Some of them at least knew it wasn't. Other people were just going along with the flow. And then the question was, well, what's the punishment for this?
There is none.
To the extent that Trump had control over it, he robbed them of their, or not robbed them. He removed their security clearances, which was absolutely appropriate under the circumstances. But where is the DOJ coming in and prosecuting them for this?
I mean, that kind of gets to the heart of the problem. Like, honestly, the meat of this whole conversation is about what is the price that the left pays for not even wielding, abusing authority, abusing power.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you want to ask, you said a line a few minutes ago that it's perfectly reasonable and understandable why people might not have trust in the intelligence community. You know, the reason why is because institutional trust across all spectrums in society is at an all-time low.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because of how the left engages in institutional capture.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, public trust in media, academia, intelligence services, in government bureaucracy, in a multitude of any form of culturally shaping institution, right? Public trust is at an all-time low because normal people, the normies out there that don't have the time to read a whole bunch of inspector general reports and analyze, the validity of, did they actually follow the legal process for the whistleblower? Did they change it? Let me look at the transcripts of the, congressional hearings and stuff like the average person doesn't have time for that type of stuff.
Yeah.
They've got other things going on in their life, but they have heuristics.
Yeah.
And they can
intellectual shortcuts that you use to determine what's true and what's not.
They can see over, year to year, decade to decade, that certain institutions have said things that are not true, have pushed things that are blatantly ideological. And at some point you get to a point where you previously thought as just a default, another heuristic, that I can trust X, Y, and Z because they're supposed to do A, B, and C.
Yeah.
And then you find out 5 or 10 or 15 years later that institution X, Y, and Z isn't actually doing A, B, and C. It's doing the eternal progressive omnicause. Well, that's what all of these institutions are doing. And that's why institutional trust is at an all-time low, because they're all doing the same thing, which is pushing leftism.
Well, and the left benefits from using the institution, and the left benefits from you losing trust in the institution. It actually benefits both ways. That's what makes it so much of an effective tactic. Like I say this before, when people kind of flippantly say we've got to abolish this or abolish that. And I'll say, okay, you can point to a lot of bad things that the organization has done, but can you also point to a lot of good things the organization has done? If the answer to that is yes, well, then you have to start asking yourself, okay, do you get rid of an institution or do you reform it? And for many of these institutions, the answer has been reform all the way up to COVID. Because COVID was such a blatant, and it's amazing because people are like, oh, you mean when Trump was president? A lot of the institutions that we lost faith in was not because of Trump appointees. It was because of the middle management within these organizations that were able to do essentially whatever they wanted, regardless of who got elected president. And so you also saw this with the blue states, where when they were running their own governments, they're the ones that did the worst crackdowns. They're the ones that would close down the churches but leave open the liquor stores, right? They did that, not Trump. But Trump got the blame for it because the heuristic that a lot of people used was, well, who's president? I guess he's to blame. The other problem, and I used to point this out to the left, because for a while, I'll give you another example of this kind of institutional rot. After Charlie Kirk was murdered, there was a couple of reports that came out that said 80% of political violence in the United States is initiated by the right. And the Democrats ran with this. And of course, the Cato Institute dutifully said, oh, we did our research, and it's not 80%, but it's definitely a large majority. And then somebody who was not a member of one of these think tanks, who was not a member of the intelligence community, who was not a member of one of these august, organizations that we're supposed to be able to trust with a data analysis, simply went through and read how they allocated violent acts to ideological causes. And what they found is that when BLM was rioting through streets, that was not left wing, right? But when a skinhead gang fought with a Hispanic gang over drug territory, that was a racially motivated hate
right-wing
crime
violence.
That was right-wing violence. Now, again, please show me. This is another thing that I absolutely despise. It's this idea that right-wing is anything racist, anything sexist, that's right-wing. So that even if a minority group attacks a white group,
if the Black Panthers,
if the Black Panthers attack, an Asian group, that's right-wing, violence. And somebody pointed out the obvious absurdity of this, but it didn't stop the mainstream press from reporting. There's another common one that just came up when I was doing a tabling event with Turning Point at Virginia Tech. A girl got up there and said, well, that illegal immigrants are actually statistically less likely to commit crimes than natural born citizens. And I said, that's not true. And she goes, yes, it is. I'll show you. I said, let me guess. You're going to show me a bunch of headlines that all cite the same study from Texas, because I know the study you're about to cite. And she put her phone down. It's like, and I remember trying to explain. I said, please understand something. If you want these organizations to have value, if you want to be able to say, Nick, I think you're wrong. Have you looked at this study? Then I have to be confident that study went about using logic, went about using the scientific method where appropriate, went about going through things like accounting for bias confirmation that allowed itself to be independently researched, studied, and vetted. But now you guys control the peer review system. And how do we know that? Well, we know it in part because of what James Lindsay and his cohorts did, Peter Boghossian and others, through the grievance study affair, where they demonstrated that you could get just about anything you wanted through peer review as long as you were saying things that the left wanted to promote. And what I was trying to explain to the left was, if you want these institutions to have validity, we have to both be able to trust the processes that they're using to arrive at their conclusions. I understand that it's never going to be perfect, that there's always new data sets that you can apply, but I have to at least be assured that you are following some sort of rigorous process in order to arrive at the truth. But here's what I've discovered. You don't. And I started to ask myself, well, why? Like, what is your problem with logic? What is your problem with linear thinking? What is your problem with the scientific method? You keep saying you're the party that believes in following the science, and yet it's your group, it's your side of the discussion that puts up things at the Smithsonian that claim that, I kid you not, claim that linear thinking, the scientific method, are attributes of whiteness. You're essentially saying that they're part of a racist construct. So the moment logic doesn't verify your claims, the moment the scientific method doesn't lead to the conclusions you prefer, you are now setting yourself up to morally be able to disregard logic and the scientific method as tools of white supremacy. Where do you think that leaves us? Because here's the problem. There's going to be some people on the right like me that will say, okay, I can no longer trust what you tell me. Right? I can no longer believe what you tell me. I can no longer believe what certain institutions tell me. I can't just take your studies and your analysis at face value, because I never know when you've thrown out logic in order to verify your claims. I never know when you completely disregard bias confirmation. I don't know. I don't know when you manipulate data sets so horribly as to come up with false conclusions because most people will just read the headline. That's one side of this. But do you want to know what other people on the right are doing? Other people on the right are saying, okay, not only can I not trust what you say, the opposite of what you say is what's the truth. That's where things get really dangerous. Because a lot of the words that the left use are not necessarily bad in and of themselves. It's true that the Nazis were bad. But if you inappropriately call people Nazis enough times and they learn that you're lying consistently, some people come to the conclusion that you're a liar. Other people come to the conclusions that maybe the Nazis weren't so bad. And you don't want them to come to that conclusion because the Nazis were bad. But when you get to use the credibility of a claim devoid of the logic, reason, or context which made it valid in the first place, you diminish the very thing you claim to care about. And this is just another example of it. This is just another example of it. But the left sets themselves up to win no matter what happens. And then the right gets all upset. The panicans, as Trump calls them. And there is an element of panicans where they're, oh, well, we can't. Imagine if the shoe was on the other foot. Can I just explain something, ladies and gentlemen? If we're not allowed to use legitimate law enforcement powers to go after people and criminally charge them when they deliberately use their position outside of the rules on which they're supposed to operate. If we can't do that, if our answer every time is to say, oh, well, we just need to move on because we need to protect the institution. No, you protect the institution by punishing people who abuse the institution. You save the process by punishing people who abuse the process. And if you're not willing to do that, well, then people are going to come to the conclusion that you're in on it, that you can't be trusted either. And then all of a sudden you get people on the right who just jump from one conspiracy theory to the next. And the moment I've done this before with people on the right, the moment I try to come and say, I understand your frustration, we may even share a common enemy on this, but this information that you're using right here doesn't make sense. This doesn't add up. You're blaming the wrong people for something. And instead of them saying, okay, Nick, what's your counter evidence? They come back with, you've been bought off. You've been paid to say that. You're part of the problem.
It's because we live in a deeply distrustful, fractured society at this point. Historically speaking,
and again, there's some conspiracies that are true, right? Conspiracies are not in and of themselves untrue because they're a theory. The question always comes down to what sort of intelligence, what sort of analysis are you using to decipher between truth and fiction? And the new heuristic, the new intellectual shortcut that we use to decide who's telling us the truth
is the opposite of what the authorities tell you.
Is the opposite of what the authorities tell us.
I was about to say, it used to be, think about all the institutions that are not directly run by the government. So, not the intelligence community, right? Yeah. Not Congress. But
academia.
Yeah, academia. I mean, arts and entertainment, media. Historically, these things have operated outside the realm of the state for most of history. It's not that like the state played no role in propaganda.
Sure.
Like that's obvious. I mean, Alexander had court historians for a reason, right? But like by and large, people historically leaned on other institutions outside the state to build basically their community around, to get information from, to, they use them as a reliable resource, again, from a heuristic standpoint, because not every single person was an expert. Nobody is in every single topic.
Well, it was also a form of accountability.
You know what happens when you destroy the credibility of non-state institutions? Mm-hmm. What happens is that people become distrustful, right? And then they end up becoming isolated, and inevitably the state has to step in to fill the void that private institutions previously filled. Yeah. Like, this is what so many people on the left and certain libertarians, I think, also don't understand, is that when you destroy these institutions and you discredit them, you don't actually create a liberated, autonomous, free individual. You create a void that the state must fill. Yeah. Inevitably, the state will step in. If you completely destroy media and you create a hyper-partisan, almost conspiratorial type mindset, what's inevitably going to happen is that the state's going to engage in more propaganda because it needs to properly educate the masses.
Yeah. Well, this is where you get Joe Biden having someone that were like a ministry of truth, where they have somebody that's coming who's clearly a partisan that is now going to help us all determine what is true and what is fake news or what is misinformation.
You get the same thing with education, right? If the educational system has been blown up, even the ones that operate outside the realm of the state directly, right? So, let's take the university system, which is partially state run, but there's also private institutions, right? I mean, some of the most famous universities in America are privately run. But if they lose their credibility, you know what's going to happen? People are going to clamor, we need the government to do X, Y, and Z because these institutions aren't giving us the truth. They're not telling us the truth. You brought up conspiracy theories. I've told a couple friends this joke. I have a feeling that if Twitter was around in our mindset that we have today, if Twitter was around in 1914, I have a feeling that there would be an enormous chunk of people who would argue that Franz Ferdinand's assassination was an inside job conducted by the Austrians in order to justify going to war.
Yeah, with Serbia.
Yeah, with Serbia. Like Conrad von Hotzendorf and Franz Joseph really killed Franz. I mean, obviously that wasn't the case. Instead, it was a different conspiracy. The Black Hand was actually being armed by Serbian military intelligence. So there were elements within the Serbian government. So that was the actual conspiracy.
Yeah.
But like, the irony in all of this is when the left hijacks institutions and then uses them to push the progressive, the eternal progressive omni cause, as some people say, you create this obvious level of distrust in society. And then the left will simply use that distrust to argue for more state power that they run. So it's kind of like a self-perpetuating feedback loop. And I don't really know how you break out of it, because the way that this ends is that people are going to get red-pilled and realize the rules only exist in the abstract. They do not defend themselves. Men get to write the rules, they get to interpret the rules, and they get to enforce the rules. And all of these mechanisms, all of these processes, they're all just abused and used and discarded by people who see them as a tool to get what they want. And the side that treats institutions and rules and procedures as a mechanism to get what they want will always defeat the side that treats, the rules and procedures and institutions as actually important things in of themselves. And this ends ultimately in a realization that I had. I've already told you this analogy, but I'll say it for the folks on the podcast. A few years ago, the legislature in Virginia had some bills that they did not get passed in time. The rules said, this bill's dead. You didn't pass it by the deadline. So the Democrats who ran the legislature at the time, still do, they just decided to reprint the previous day's floor calendar in order to pass the bill. And at that point, it is pretty much impossible for you to see that happen in person and not conclude that oh, this is all just fake. All of this is just fake. At the end of the day, this is all just going to go down to just will and strength and force. And if it gets really bad, violence and the threat of violence. And that's the world that we're heading in, because all of these processes that previously were universally accepted and defended for their own sake have been abused and chucked aside by one side.
Again, we're going back, and we're going back to the thing, and Carl Benjamin talks about this as well, but it's the idea that the processes have validity when the people believe that the processes are just and that they're helping to achieve at least what is perceived to be as fair outcomes. Because again, most people are reasonable to the point where they understand not everything's going to be perfect, but they wanted to at least have the semblance of justice, right? As long as it's doing a good job for the majority of the time, that's better than abandoning it and trying to start over. I think what needs to be understood is the left benefits from wearing these institutions as a skin suit, like Iowa Hawk said, all the way up to the point where they lose credibility, and then they lose benefit from the fact that it lost credibility. Because like you said, people start grasping on to what can I really trust? And the standard for what can I trust, the standard for truth is no longer, here are the processes that we use, or here's the faith that I apply. It's whoever counter signals the loudest is the only one I can trust. And you'll notice too, in a lot of the process, whenever someone is counter signaling, they're constantly talking about how they're in danger and how they need you to protect them, and they're protecting you because they're giving you the truth when nobody else will. It leads to, by necessity, it leads to almost cult-like behavior, unless you can grasp onto something that supersedes it. Like the thing that keeps me from like blackpilling or just doom spiraling or whatever else is I'm a Christian, which means even when somebody that I might typically agree with says something that I think is incorrect or untrue, there's a standard outside of myself that I get to appeal to. That standard is critical to my identity. I'm not allowed to alter it in favor of whatever my preference might be, I have a duty to alter my preferences in accordance with it. And I think more and more I'm seeing this where there's just been so much distrust that, again, it's just whoever counter signals the loudest is correct. And I've asked this before because I had somebody the other day say, Nick, I agree with 90% of what you say. Like I agree with it. I really think that you're a fighter for truth. Why do you have a problem with Candace Owens? And I responded with, because I don't think we use the same standard for truth, especially when it comes to accusing people of something. If I'm going to accuse somebody of something that is a pretty significant accusation, and we're not talking about like abstract things from the standpoint of like, I accuse the left of wanting to subvert American institutions because they don't have any genuine love for it. I base that off of their own writings, who they follow, their actions, their behaviors, etc. But if I were to accuse Mark Warner of killing someone, I would need sufficient information to be able to make that accusation. And that's the standard of truth. Like, what is what is my evidence? Does my evidence actually logically follow to the conclusions I'm asking you to take on? And have I followed that in a process that coincides with what the Bible tells me about not making false accusations? So there's the standard. And if you can point to where I violated that standard, it is my obligation to correct myself. When I see people who don't follow that standard, when I see people that it at least from my perspective of their analysis, falls way outside of any sort of objective standard which I can appeal to. If the moment I appeal to that objective standard, you automatically accuse me of being paid off, a cuck, a shill, bought off, a fake, a phony, well, then now what evidence am I supposed to use to convince you that I'm not those things? Well, there's only one piece of evidence. You have to agree with me. You have to come to my conclusion. And the thing is that I saw that all the time with the left. I saw it all the time with the left. The only way, I'll never forget getting a letter from a family member. And this family member didn't want to discuss. They even told me that this is not a discussion. This is not a debate. I'm telling you.
Oh, I already know this is going to be a good one.
And they got to tell me what I believed. And I didn't get to respond. I don't get to defend myself. And then at the end of the letter, it's once you've decided that your beliefs are wrong, once you've accepted my interpretation of your beliefs and the motivation for your beliefs, then maybe we can talk again. Then maybe we can be family again. And what this has served to do is it's actually caused people on the right to be like, I'm adopting the same playbook because I can't trust anybody except for the people that is validating the way I feel in this moment.
Can we differentiate though for a second? But this is not my attempt to like defend people like Candace Owens and stuff like that. I'm sorry, but if you think Turning Point USA killed Charlie Kirk, you're an idiot. It's as simple as that. Like you.
But what's your point about?
But by and large, the right is responding to something that the left has done.
Yeah.
So the conspiratorial mindset, the loss in institutional trust, it's actually understandable.
Yes.
And
completely.
In certain instances, it's not only understandable, it's correct.
Yes.
Like we spent all this time. I mean, I just brought up the Candace Owens, Charlie Kirk thing. Yeah, there's certain times where this is all BS, but there are other times where no, it's totally true. This is a perfect example. The Hunter Biden laptop story, the Adam Schiff colluding with this fake whistleblower in order to justify impeaching Trump. The Steele dossier. Like, there's so many examples.
Well, and more went on it's right and left, but the Epstein files. I'm furious about that.
You brought this up earlier. The left telling people, the real pandemic is whiteness and racism, and so we're gonna lock the country down, but you can go out onto the streets and burn cars and trash downtown. Like, all of these things are real. All of them happened, and all of them are perfect examples of why the right has become so low trust, conspiracy minded. It's because the left did it to them.
Well, it's because there were actual conspiracies. This was a conspiracy. But here's the difference. Tulsi Gabbard brought actual receipts. Not vibes, she brought actual receipts. She said, okay, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Here it is, here's the evidence. And you look at what Senator Warner says in response, right? Senator Warner doesn't say, I'm questioning the validity of your evidence. Senator Warner doesn't say,
no, he said this was politically motivated.
He goes, I'm questioning the validity of your timeline. He didn't say that. It's the old thing where the left will call you all sorts of things, but they don't call you a liar, right? He's not questioning the evidence, the timeline, or the logical conclusions based off of that evidence or timeline. Instead, what he's doing is he's creating a victim, the whistleblower. And he's saying, no, you're just attacking a whistleblower. Therefore, I can ignore all of your evidence. And again, there's elements on the right that are adopting the same thing now, where it's like, no, because I want this outcome, because I don't trust anything, I can ignore any evidence to the contrary of what I'm being currently told. And what I'm saying is that is part of what the left has done. That is part of what they've accomplished. The goal was not to simply use institutions or destroy institutions. The goal was to demoralize people to the degree where they can no longer decipher between the truth and a lie. And when you can no longer decipher that because you can no longer trust the institutions or even the processes that you used to rely upon to do it, because they've been so undermined within academia, within the media, within Hollywood, within our political system, then what are people left with? A tribe. They're left with easily identifiable characteristics that allow them to distinguish friend from foe. And the moment you step outside of it, you're an automatic foe. I saw this the other day where I gave a very, Candace went after Victor Marx, who I know, who I consider to be a friend, and who I think has done incredible work, not just for conservatism. He's done incredible work actually saving children out of human trafficking situations. And all of a sudden, she just drops all these accusations against him. They're not backed up. They're not backed up by a mountain of evidence. They're backed up by innuendo. They're backed up by quote unquote receipts that don't actually align with anything. That don't actually follow to the conclusions that she's asking you to accept. And the moment I'm like, I've got a problem with this, somebody comes on and like, oh, you too, huh, Nick? Wait a second. You didn't even engage with my argument. It was just, no, this signifies this, and so you're bad. That has always been a left-wing way to view things. And now it's becoming a right-wing way to view things. And what I want the right to understand is, please don't fall into a trap that the left has already set. I'm not asking anybody to throw out all that. Look, a conspiracy theory should be tested on its merits. And the government telling you it's not a conspiracy is not sufficient evidence of no conspiracy. Because we know the government engages in conspiracies all the time. But there still has to be a standard for evidence and truth and analysis. And there still has to be a standard with respect to how we bring accusations. Part of the reason why I think this took longer than a lot of the Americans wanted is because they looked at everything that was going on and it seemed obvious. Obviously, something is going on. Yes, but if you want to prosecute somebody, if you want the charges to stick, if you want them to actually do time, you have to be able to make a sufficient case within our legal system. And in order to do that, you have to build sufficient evidence, show a good timeline, and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that's what happened. What they're so frustrated with is they don't feel that applies when the left is in power. And the honest answer is because it doesn't, at least not to the degree it should. And what the left needs to understand is if you think you're going to get away with this, you aren't. You aren't. These processes had validity for a reason. You can't just wear them around as a skin suit for your own personal objectives. Because what you will create is the thing you claim to fear. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. I don't know who wins this ultimate fight that we're having in the United States right now. I don't know who wins. I just know that the woke lose. The woke lose because you cannot make your entire political ideology rooted in this idea that I'm going to alienate young men because they're responsible for all the world's ills. And then I'm going to elevate anyone based off of whatever victim mentality they claim. Wherever they score on the intersectional pyramid of victim Olympics, those are the people that are going to be the vanguards of the revolution. Good luck with that. You're not going to fight wars, police streets, fight fires, build buildings, build civilization, or protect civilization, but with people who define themselves by their mental illnesses. You lose. But you are creating the conditions where you're going to be punished very badly. And I don't mean punished in the legal way in which some of you deserve to be. I mean, you're going to be punished by a complete revolt against the institutions that are supposed to protect all of us from false claims and false accusations. But if those institutions don't start doing a better job of protecting all of us, of actually providing equality before the law, enough people on both sides are going to conclude that they're worthless. And then all we're left with is violence. And I don't think the woke win a contest of who can be more violent. I just don't think you do. So my hope right now is that the Department of Justice has sufficient evidence to go after, prosecute these people, and I want to see jail time. I want to see perp walks. And I understand that it has to follow a process. I still believe in that process. But if you want people to continue to believe in the process, there has to be consequences for this. And yes, the left is going to come out and they're going to kick and they're going to scream because they always do. But understand the left, especially this elements of the left, they don't care about this process. If it serves their political end states, great. And if it doesn't, fine, throw it out. We don't care. They want to replace it with new processes anyways. So to the panicans, to the weak people on the right who are constantly worried about Democrats getting angry with them, getting angry with you is what they do to keep you from actually fighting against what they're doing to you. Christian did a whole episode about this on his channel. Go check it out. You can't keep falling for it. You can't keep falling for it. But by the same token, if we are not fighting for an objective standard of truth, if we don't have an objective standard by which we determine that which is true and that which is false, and it has to go beyond just our simple bias confirmation, we're not going to create a world worth defending. And so I would request respectfully that yes, question things, question me, that's fine. But have an objective standard for truth. I use the one Scripture provides. It's never let me down. Once again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to Tulsi Gabbard for the important work that she's been doing. Let's hope that the DOJ can mount sufficient cases and can do this swiftly, but within the processes and the way it's supposed to work with respect to due process. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next episode.